Orson Belandi was 34 years old, and in all 34 of those years, nobody had ever dared lie to him twice. They called him the boss of the Baltimore waterfront. They lowered their eyes when he walked past, and yet here he lay, inside a closed casket, in the middle of his own viewing, unable to open his eyes, unable to move a single finger, unable to make a sound, and hearing every last thing. The slow drag of the organ overhead, the lilies, sweet enough to choke on, the steady shuffle of people filing past, saying the things people always say at a funeral. He went too soon. Such a shame. Call us if you need anything. His wife Sloane stood beside the casket for hours, accepting condolences, playing the grieving widow perfectly for a room full of people who feared her and loved her in equal measure. She had no idea her husband could hear every word spoken above him. Then, as the crowd thinned and the footsteps drifted toward the doors, two people stopped beside him. A hand settled on the rim of the casket, light and familiar, and Sloane's voice came, low and warm and meant for exactly one other person. Thank you for making sure it looked like an accident. No one will ever know. Orson recognized the man who answered her at once, the man he had called a brother for 25 years. He lay there, silent, locked inside a casket with his own name on it, and understood everything. But there was one thing neither of them standing over him that night had accounted for. Hours later, after the funeral home had gone dark, a woman would push open the door of that room. She had not come to say goodbye to anyone. She had come looking for the truth, and she was the last person on earth with any reason to save Orson Belandi. If this story reached you, leave a like so I know you're still listening. Send it to someone you think needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so we can meet again tomorrow with another story. The final door closed. A bolt slid into place, slowly and securely. Then the lights went out. They didn't all go dark at once. Each row went out separately, everyone lowering the darkness another degree until the only thing left was the steady sound of a ventilation fan running somewhere overhead. Orson lay motionless inside his own darkness. He counted the rhythm of the fan, not to calm himself, to know he was still conscious. He knew the anger was there. It lay just beneath his ribcage, hot and dense, waiting to rise. But anger was fire, and he had only one tank of fuel left. He forced it down. He would bring it out later. Right now, he needed something much smaller. He chose the tip of his right index finger, only that single point. He gathered everything remaining inside him and forced it into a space no larger than the head of a match. Nothing happened. He tried again. Nothing. A third time. A fourth. A 10th. He stopped counting. He simply pushed. Then came a twitch, so small that he nearly missed it. Smaller than a heartbeat, but it was real. He held on to it. He worked at it the way someone loosens a knot pulled too tight. Not with strength, but with relentless persistence. Push, rest, push. His index finger moved. Then his middle finger. Then his entire hand slid a short distance across the lining, awkwardly, like something that had forgotten what it was made to do. He stopped and breathed. Only breathed. He allowed his lungs to continue doing what his body had apparently been doing in secret for so long, the thing that had deceived everyone in the room. Then he moved to his wrist. The wrist was harder. It answered with pain that traveled backward into his shoulder, deep and dull. He welcomed that pain almost gratefully. Pain meant there were nerves. Nerves meant there was still a road back. He lifted his arm. It rose about 8 inches, then fell. He raised it again. It fell. Again. In the darkness, there was nothing by which to measure time except the fan and his own breathing. He didn't know how long it had been. He only knew that every time his arm fell, he lifted it again. His shoulder came next. Then his back. His back was the worst. It felt as though his entire body had adhered to the lining, like an object left too long inside a cramped space. He strained. Nothing. He strained again. Something in his spine yielded, but only slightly. He rolled onto his side, forced his weight onto his left elbow, and pushed. Sweat ran into his eyes even though he still couldn't open them. He pushed. Then his back lifted away from where he had been lying. His upper body rose, slowly, trembling and out of rhythm. Both hands found the wooden sides and gripped them. He sat up. He sat in the darkness with both hands digging into the edge of the wood, his chest heaving, his body swaying like a man who had climbed an entire mountain no one else could see. His eyelids opened to a narrow slit. Then they opened fully. The darkness before him was still darkness, but it was the darkness of a room, not the darkness of a box. There was a difference he would never be able to explain to anyone. He remained there for a long time. He thought of only one thing, and he considered it calmly, almost coldly, the way a man rereads a contract he has already signed. 2 people in this world were certain he was dead. Both were wrong. and both would learn the truth at the moment he chose, not 1 minute sooner. He had barely completed that thought when the door to the room opened. Clementine Barlow had been sitting in the hallway of Harmon Cross Funeral Home for nearly 4 hours. Inside her purse was a craft paper envelope bearing a hospital seal. It contained the personal belongings of a deceased patient and a transfer form requiring the signature of a family member. That was procedure. It was the only legitimate reason she had for being there. 3 times she stood. 3 times she walked to within 5 steps of the visitation room door. And 3 times she returned to her chair. The Belandi family was inside. She couldn't hand that envelope to any of them, not because she was afraid, because she knew that if she opened her mouth, what came out wouldn't be the question, "Who can sign this for me?" So she sat. She watched people pass before her, men dressed in dark clothing, women wearing shoes that made no sound, people shaking hands with both of theirs. Then they gradually thinned out, then they were gone. At 9 o'clock, the funeral director entered the hallway to turn off some of the lights and saw her. He was in his 60s, and he stood there for a long time looking at the envelope on her lap. She told him she was from Harbor Mercy, that she needed to deliver the belongings and obtain a signature, and that she could return the following morning if it wasn't a convenient time. He asked her name. She told him. He asked nothing else. He merely said she could come inside, and that he would sign for the items. Then he walked ahead of her, opened the visitation room door, and switched on a single lamp in the corner. Clem entered and stopped. A man was sitting on the edge of the coffin. The funeral director froze in the doorway. Clem didn't scream. She heard her heart pounding all the way into her ears, felt the entire room tilt for 1 beat, and somewhere far away inside her mind, a voice spoke with merciless calm, in the same tone it always used at 3 in the morning inside the intensive care unit. "This man is breathing. Do your job." She placed her purse on the floor. She took a penlight from her pocket. She approached him neither quickly nor slowly, moving at the same pace she used when walking toward a hospital bed. And she spoke in her usual voice, neither high nor low. "I'm going to examine your eyes. Don't move." The man said nothing. She shone the light into his right eye. The pupil contracted. She checked the left. It contracted too. She switched off the penlight. "Can you see me?" "Yes," he said. His voice was dry and raw, like sandpaper being dragged across wood. "What is your name?" "Orson Belandi." "What year is it?" He gave her the year. "Where are you?" He was silent for 1 beat. Then he said, "Inside a box on Clement Street." Clem took his left wrist to check his pulse. Her hand was trembling. She could see it trembling and couldn't stop it. So she allowed it to shake and focused only on keeping 3 fingertips in the correct position. Beneath them, his pulse was slow and weak, but steady. As she counted, she realized that the hand she was holding was missing 1 joint from the little finger. It was an old injury, healed long ago. She counted for the full 60 seconds. Then she lowered his hand. She didn't ask a single question about the finger. "You need to go to the hospital immediately," she said. "Not yet," he replied. "You've just spent 3 weeks inside a coffin." 3 hours, he said. 3 weeks would be something else. Clem straightened and, for the first time, looked at him as a human being instead of a medical case. "Do you know who you are?" "I just told you." "No," she said. "I mean, do you understand what that name means to other people?" He looked at her. She continued without raising her voice by even a degree. 2 years ago, I signed a settlement agreement with your company's name printed at the top of the page. Doc 9. Would you like to know how much they paid me to put my signature on it?" In the corner, the funeral director quietly closed the door. Orson Belandi sat on the edge of his own coffin, looking at the woman who had just saved his life, and understood that the night ahead would be much longer than he had imagined. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he asked one of his own. "Why are you here?" Clem bent down, picked up the purse from the floor, placed it on the small table against the wall, and removed a hospital-sealed envelope. To return this, then she took out a second item, a sheet of paper folded into quarters, its edges worn from being opened and refolded too many times. She smoothed it across the table and turned it toward him. "And to give this back to myself," she said. He looked at the page. He recognized his name in the upper left corner, the date, the patient code, and a long series of entries he didn't understand. She placed her fingertip on a line near the bottom. "Here," she said. "This substance doesn't appear on any of your prescriptions. It isn't in your medical history. I don't need to know what it is, and I won't say its name in this room. I know only one thing." She raised her eyes to his. "It shouldn't have been in your blood." Orson read the line. Then he read it again. "When?" he asked. "The night of the 14th, she said. "The sample was drawn within the first 30 minutes after they brought you in. I was working that shift. I personally signed for the sample." "Then what happened?" "I entered a note in your chart," she said. I reported it to the charge nurse. The charge nurse reported it to someone above her. 3 days later, I received a suspension notice. The reason listed was alteration of a medical record. He remained silent. She continued in the same even voice, the steady voice of someone who had repeated this story to herself too many times. I accessed the system again the following day. That line was gone. It hadn't simply been deleted. It had been replaced with another entry, one that was clean, reasonable, and left nothing to question. If I hadn't kept this printout, I would now be nothing more than a nurse who invented a story and was dismissed for it. The only sound in the room was the ventilation fan. Orson lowered the page. "Is there anything else?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "and this is the part that keeps me awake." She pulled out the room's only chair, sat opposite him, and rested both hands on her thighs. "Your death certificate was signed by a physician named Pell. I've worked at Harbor Mercy for 6 years. I have never met him. He doesn't belong to the intensive care unit. He wasn't on duty that night, and his name doesn't appear anywhere in your record until the final entry." He said nothing. "Your family declined an autopsy," she continued. "They declined in writing, in less than 2 hours. Your entire file was closed within 24 hours. She allowed the silence to remain just long enough. "Do you know how long it normally takes to close the file on a sudden death?" "Not 24 hours. Something very cold traveled down Orson's spine and remained there. He had spent hours in the darkness thinking about 2 people. Now he understood that 2 people weren't enough. Someone had to sign. Someone had to be inside the hospital. Someone had to replace a line inside a system that not everyone was authorized to touch." He looked up. "Miss Barlow." She didn't answer. "I need something," he said. "I need to remain dead for a few more days." She studied him for a long time. "Do you understand what you're asking me to do?" "I do. You're asking a nurse who is already under investigation for falsifying a medical record to hide a living man. If this is exposed, you lose a few days. I lose my entire profession." "If this isn't exposed," he said, "you've already lost your profession." The words struck their mark. She fell silent. He continued, slowly and clearly. "You need evidence to reclaim your name. I need time to preserve my life. Both things are in the same place." Clem remained still for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "All right, but I have conditions." He nodded. 1. You don't pay me a single cent. No money, no gifts, no debt forgiveness, no job. Anything you give me, I will return." "Agreed," he said. 2. Anything I give you can be taken only to a place where there is an attorney and a prosecutor. If anyone is harmed because of information I provide, even one person, I will go to the police myself and tell them everything." He looked at her. "Agreed." 3, she said, and this time her voice changed. "If when this is over, I discover that Doc 9 also leads back to you, remember that I was the one who pulled you out of that box. I'll accept responsibility for my part." Orson Belandi remained silent for a long time. Then he extended his left hand, the hand missing one joint from the little finger, and said, "Agreed." The funeral director had remained beside the door the entire time. His name was Harmon, and in 40 years of doing this work, he had never once been forced to consider a situation like this. Orson turned toward him. "You already know what I'm about to ask of you," he said. "Mr." Harmon didn't answer immediately. He walked over, stood beside the coffin, and studied it for a long time as though it were something that had just lied to him. Then he said, "I took care of your father. Do you remember?" "I remember," Orson said. "I carried the left side at his head, Mr." Harmon said. "Your mother asked me to make him look the way he did when he sat down for breakfast. I worked for 3 nights. He paused. "Now you're asking me to keep quiet. All you have to tell me is how long." "A few days," Orson said. "Perhaps less. I'm not asking you to lie for the rest of your life. I'm asking you to remain silent long enough for me to stay alive." "Mr." Harmon nodded exactly once, then went outside and returned with a borrowed coat and someone else's shoes. Orson used the landline in the outer room. He dialed only one number. Walter Odom answered after 2 rings. "Wally, it's me," Orson said. There was no sound from the other end. Nothing at all for so long that Orson could hear the older man breathing, the breath of someone who had just been struck in the center of the chest. Then Wally asked, "Where are you?" Orson gave him the address. Wally ended the call without saying goodbye. 20 minutes later, his car stopped outside the rear entrance. He entered the room, stood about 3 paces from Orson, and stared at him. He stared for a long time. Wally had driven for the family for 28 years. He had driven Orson's father. He had driven Orson when the boy still needed an extra cushion beneath him just to see through the window. Now he stood there looking at him in burial clothes and a borrowed coat. His eyes reddened. He didn't raise a hand to wipe them. "Young master," he said, "are you certain?" "No," Orson answered. Wally nodded as though that was precisely the answer he had needed. Then he turned toward Clem, looked her over from head to foot, and asked whether she was family. She said she was a nurse. He asked nothing else. Wally took them to an abandoned fish canning factory on the South Shore, a property Orson had purchased 6 years earlier under the name of a dead man. It didn't appear on any list Sloane had ever touched, and that was the only reason it was safe. During the first 3 days, Orson's body barely obeyed him. He could stand and walk about 10 steps before he had to grip the wall. His right hand trembled when he held a cup. Sometimes he began a sentence and lost the final word somewhere before reaching the end. Clem addressed each problem separately. She made him sleep on his side. She checked his pulse every 4 hours and recorded it in a small notebook. She made him drink water on a schedule and lift his feet from the floor 100 times every morning. When he completed 90 and stopped, she stood there watching until he finished the remaining 10. She wasn't gentle with him in the slightest. She wasn't afraid of him in the slightest either. On the second night, while removing the cuff from his arm, he spoke. "Miss Barlow," she answered without looking up. "What? Why didn't you leave?" Her hand stopped for exactly 1 beat. It was a question she should have needed time to consider, but she had already been thinking about it for 3 days. "Because I'm a nurse," she said, "not because of who you are." She coiled the tubing, placed it inside her bag, then added in a slightly quieter voice, "That night at Dock 9, someone arrived before the ambulance. They told me to step back and let them handle it. I stepped back. I did it because I believed it wasn't my responsibility." She closed the bag. "I haven't stepped back since." Then she walked into the inner room. Near dawn, Orson went onto the porch alone. He stood looking across the dark water and dialed a number he had known by heart for 15 years. The person on the other end answered immediately and said nothing, only waited. Orson spoke 3 words. "Not yet. Wait." Then he ended the call. In the inner room, Clem stood silently beside the partly open door, still holding the notebook containing his pulse readings, and for the first time since the night at the funeral home, she remembered with perfect clarity who was living beneath the same roof as her. Clem reached home before the sky had fully brightened. The apartment she shared with her brother occupied the ground floor of an old row house, 3 blocks from the docks, and a wooden ramp crossed the front step, a ramp she had built herself 2 years earlier. It was crooked, one side about half a knuckle higher than the other. She had intended to repair it for 2 years, and hadn't done so once. The lights inside were still on. Tobin sat at the table with both monitors glowing and his hands moving constantly across the keyboard. He was 21, his hair standing upright from sitting there too long, his wheelchair pushed close to the edge of the table. 3 envelopes lay beside his elbow. Clem noticed them before she looked at her brother's face. 3 of them, stacked together, each with a clear plastic window and the same line printed in the lower right corner. "Where were you all night?" Tobin asked without turning around. "Covering someone's shift," Clem said. "You're suspended. A shift somewhere else." She entered the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and allowed the running water to fill the silence created by her lie. Tobin didn't ask anything else. He merely called into the kitchen, his voice still half teasing as it always was. "If you go to prison, I'll be here alone eating instant noodles 3 times a day. Remember that." Clem gave a short laugh. She took out 2 glasses, filled them with water, and carried them to the table, placing one beside his keyboard. The screen displayed long lines of text she didn't understand, green and gray, stretching down the page. "What kind of contract is that?" she asked. "An insurance company in Ohio," Tobin said. $40 an hour. They pay late, but they pay." He typed several more lines, leaned back, then turned to look at her. "You know, the medical record system at your hospital is incredibly outdated. Why are you suddenly talking about that?" "Because last week I picked up another side job involving hospital software from the same era as the system where you work." He shrugged. "It's so old that it permanently stores logs showing who signed in, which file they opened, the exact hour and minute, and which line they changed. There's no delete button. No one cleans anything out. The records have been sitting there for more than a decade. We told them they should upgrade. They said it would cost too much." Clem took a sip of water. "I see," she said. Then she lowered the glass and didn't think about it again. She looked at the 3 envelopes. "How many more arrived today?" 2. "The 3rd came last week." Tobin spoke casually, with the kind of casualness he had spent 2 years learning to perform. "I haven't opened them. I thought that if I didn't open them, they wouldn't count as real yet." Clem picked up all 3 envelopes, folded them, and placed them inside her coat pocket. "Let me handle them. You always say that. Let me handle it. You work nights, then cover other people's shifts. How many hours do you sleep each day? Do you think I can't count? I'm fine." Tobin studied his sister for a while. Then he turned back toward the screen. "Yes," he said. "You're fine." Clem went to her room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed without removing her coat. She took out the 3 envelopes, arranged them across her lap, and didn't open any of them. She knew the total. She knew it down to the last dollar because she had recalculated it every month for the past 2 years, and she knew where that number had begun. It began on an October afternoon inside a conference room, where the air conditioning was far too cold. When she was 26 and Tobin was lying in the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor with a breathing tube in his throat, 4 people in dark clothing sat across the table from her with a document between them. They told her that if she signed, the money would reach her account within 7 business days. They told her the first 3 surgeries were the most important, and that a delay of even 1 month would make an enormous difference. They spoke slowly and kindly. Not one of them raised a voice at her. The final line of the document contained a clause printed in small letters stating that she would make no public statement, file no complaint, and request no reopening of anything connected to the night at Dock 9. She read that line. She read it very carefully. Then she thought about the breathing tube on the 3rd floor, and she signed. Her father remained in the morgue for 11 days before he could be buried, because the paperwork still had to be completed. During those 11 days, his daughter had exchanged her silence for the life of his son. Clem sat motionless in her room until daylight completely filled the sky. Then she placed the 3 envelopes inside a drawer, stood, and went to wash her face. Simon Abernathy arrived at the abandoned fish factory the following afternoon. He placed his leather briefcase on the floor, looked at Orson for exactly 2 seconds, then pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Start at the beginning." Orson told him everything. Simon didn't interrupt once. When Orson finished, Simon remained motionless for a while longer with both hands lying flat on the table, and what appeared on his face wasn't shock. It was something far colder than shock. Then he asked, "What do you want me to do?" Orson pushed Clem's paper, folded into quarters, across the table. "I want this turned into something we can use," he said. Simon glanced at the document, looked up, and gave a very slight shake of his head. "This is a personal printout, kept by someone who has been suspended for allegedly altering a medical record. If you present this to anyone, the first thing they will ask is where she obtained it, and the second thing they will do is bury both her and the paper. Then what do we do?" Simon took a pen from the inside pocket of his coat. "You have to obtain it yourself," he said. "You are the patient. A patient has the right to request a copy of his medical record. You sign the request, I notarize it, and I submit it through my office, using the proper form and the proper channel. No sneaking, no buying, no favors. Whatever they return to you will be clean, and it can be used anywhere." Clem stood against the doorframe with her arms folded, listening to everything. She looked at Orson. She said nothing, but she was waiting to see what he would choose. Orson took the pen. For 20 years, he had never entered any matter through the front door. He signed his name on the request slowly, 1 letter at a time, then pushed it back to Simon. "There is one problem," Simon said as he placed the form inside his briefcase. "According to the official record, you are dead. Dead men don't sign requests. So you have to choose. Either I leave the date blank, submit it later after you reveal that you're alive, and lose time, or I submit it now with the true date. And within 48 hours, at least one person in the hospital will see your name on a form dated this week. Submit it now," Orson said. "Are you certain? If they panic, they will begin cleaning," Orson said. "People who clean up always leave more traces than people who remain still." Simon studied him for a moment, then nodded and closed the briefcase. 2 days later, Harbor Mercy sent the records to Simon's office, complete and bearing both the official seal and the signature of the record's custodian. Simon brought them to the fish factory and spread them across the table. Clem read them first. She moved quickly, one finger traveling down every page, and when she reached the 6th page, she stopped. She read it again. Then she placed her old printout beside it and aligned the 2 pages. They were identical. The same patient code, the same date, the same collection time, the same technician's name. Only one line was different. On the hospital copy, that line stated that no abnormality had been detected. Simon bent over the pages and studied them for a long time. Then he straightened and spoke very quietly. "People don't alter a medical record to hide a mistake. They alter it to hide a person." Clem picked up her phone. She called Hattie Oyalaran, the charge nurse on the intensive care unit's night shift, who had worked at Harbor Mercy for 30 years and was the only person in the hospital who had continued sending Clem messages after her suspension. The 2 women met that afternoon in the employee parking lot. Hattie brought an old envelope with curled edges. She handed it to Clem without saying anything. Inside was another printout. It came from the same night and contained the same line, but it had been printed at 4:12 in the morning, with the printer's automatic timestamp at the bottom of the page, 3 hours before anyone had touched the system. Clem looked at it, and her hands went cold. "Why did you keep this?" she asked. Hattie pulled her sweater more tightly around herself. "I've printed everything for 30 years, she said. "When I first started, the computers crashed all the time. A lost record could mean a lost life. So I printed everything. The computers don't crash anymore, but I still print." She shrugged. "People have laughed at me for years." "Then why did you keep this one separately?" Clem asked. Hattie looked at her. "Because I watched them remove you from the unit for telling the truth," she said. "That wasn't something I could get used to." Simon returned that evening, this time carrying a laptop. He set it on the table, opened it, then sat staring at the screen for a while without typing anything. "Can you still access the company's system?" he asked. "Yes," Orson said. "No one has locked me out." "No one has locked you out because no one thinks they need to lock out a dead man." "That's right," Orson said. Simon turned the laptop toward him, "Then sign in." While he waited, he took a hardbound notebook and a pen from his briefcase and placed them neatly to his right. "From now until morning," he said, "I'm not going to discuss anything except documents. Don't give me your feelings. Don't give me guesses. You will answer only 3 questions. Was it signed? Where was it signed? And on what date?" Then he began to work. He worked like a man who had spent 20 years reading things their authors hoped no one would ever examine too closely. He said nothing aloud. He opened files, scrolled through them, went back, clicked one item twice. Now and then he stopped and wrote a brief line in the notebook without looking up. Orson sat at the head of the table and asked no questions. He had learned long ago that impatience was something a man always paid for. Clem stood leaning against the kitchen counter, holding a glass of water that had gone cold, her eyes fixed on the clock hanging on the wall. 40 minutes passed. Then Simon leaned back and turned the screen around. "There are 2 things," he said. "First," he pointed to a document near the top of the list. "Your family trust was restructured. It wasn't dissolved or merged. Only the allocation of authority was changed. Certain powers were taken out of your hands and consolidated under an executive group that can meet without you being present. The filings were submitted together, in the same batch, during the same week." Orson looked at the date in the upper corner. 3 months before the night at the pier. 3 months before, Simon said, as though he had just read the thought in Orson's mind. "Second," he scrolled down and stopped at a much shorter document, only 3 pages long. "This is a succession addendum attached to the charter. It states that if you become incapacitated or die, temporary control passes immediately to a specifically named individual. There is no need to wait for the board to meet, and no need to wait for confirmation from a court." He turned the screen a little farther. "The person named is Cormac Ferrante." In the kitchen, Clem set down her glass. Simon scrolled to the final page. On the last line was a signature. Simon said nothing. He simply waited. Orson bent down to look. He stared at it for a long time. He studied the hooked stroke in the first letter, the way the final letter swept downward and then curved upward, the slant, the spacing between the 2 words. It looked right. It looked so convincing that if someone had placed it before him in a stack of 40 documents waiting for his signature in the morning, he would have signed the next page without pausing. But he knew something no one else could know. He knew he had never held this document in his hands. "That is not my signature," he said. Simon looked at him. "You're certain?" "Certain. You could have signed it in a stack of papers without reading it. That happens to everyone." "It could have," Orson said, "but not this one, not this document." Simon lowered the laptop screen halfway and sat motionless. Then he spoke, slowly and with great clarity. "Do you understand what we just saw?" Orson did not answer. 3 months before that night," Simon said, "someone rearranged your family trust. In the same round of filings, someone added an amendment, stating that if you died, control would pass immediately into the hands of one man, without going through anyone else. And on that amendment is your signature. The signature you have just said is not yours." He paused. "This is motive, and it has a date." The only sound left in the factory was the faint hum of the computer. Orson sat still, both hands resting on the tabletop, while 3 months of an ordinary year began passing through his mind, one by one. The dinners, the meetings, a hand resting on his shoulder in the hallway, a familiar voice telling him not to worry. Leave it to me. Through those 3 months, he had gone on living as he always had. Only now did he understand that all that time, a clock had been running somewhere beyond his hearing. Simon left close to midnight. Clem cleared the table, stacked the documents into neat piles, and as she gathered the sheets of scrap paper, 3 envelopes slipped from the pocket of the coat she had draped over the back of a chair. They fell face up on the floor, their clear plastic windows turned directly toward Orson. He saw the name of the debt collection agency. He saw the line printed in bold at the bottom. Clem bent down and picked them up quickly. Without saying anything, she slipped them back into her coat pocket and continued sorting the papers. He didn't ask her right away. He waited until she had finished, waited until she had washed the glass, waited until she sat in the chair across from him, and opened the notebook where she recorded his pulse. Then he spoke. "How much do you owe?" Clem didn't look up. "That has nothing to do with you. I asked how much you owe." She closed the notebook. "Why are you asking?" "So I can pay it," he said. The factory fell silent. Orson continued, his voice still even, the voice of a man explaining something self-evident. "I can take care of it before sunrise. No banks, no courts, nothing left under your name. Tomorrow morning, you'll wake up, and it will be gone. You'll open that drawer and find nothing inside." Clem looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, and there was none of the gratitude in her eyes that he was accustomed to seeing in others at moments like this. There was something else. "Do you know how many people in my life have sat across from me and said those exact words?" she asked. He didn't answer. "One," she said. "Exactly one person. He spoke kindly too. He never raised his voice either. He told me that if I let him take care of it, I would wake up the next morning and everything would feel lighter. And I believed him." She placed both hands on the table. "I believed him, and I signed. And I really was lighter. For exactly 7 business days." Orson sat motionless. "Then I lived with that lightness for another 2 years, she said. "Do you know how much that lightness weighs now? It weighs exactly as much as a man lying in a morgue for 11 days, while his daughter didn't dare open her mouth and demand a single answer from anyone. That was the price of letting someone else pay for me once. If you pay the rest now," she said, "then I will have sold 1 more death. The only difference is that this time, it will be my own." Orson couldn't find anything to say. He had sat at the head of tables far longer than this one, facing men with more money than he had, and more guns than he had. And never once had he found himself without an answer. "Miss Barlow," he said, "I know you aren't trying to humiliate me." Clem cut in, her voice never rising. "I know you think it's simple. For you, it really is simple. You reach out your hand, 1 name disappears from a list, and that's the end of it. But what you don't understand is that every time you reach out like that, the person on the other side loses something you can't see." She paused. "That is the only thing I have left. I'm keeping it." Orson looked down at his hand. His left hand, missing 1 joint from the little finger, rested palm up on the wooden table, the posture of a man offering something. He closed it and drew it back. "All right," he said. "All right. I won't touch it." Clem gave a single nod, opened the notebook again, and spoke in her ordinary voice, as though nothing had happened. "Give me your hand. It's time to check it." Outside the door, Wally stood with his hat in his hands. No one knew how long he had been there. He had driven for this father and son for 28 years. He had sat waiting in the car while people inside exchanged envelopes and promises. He had watched dozens of people sit in the very place where Clem was sitting now, and not one of them had ever said no. He watched Orson withdraw his hand. He said nothing. He simply put his hat back on and quietly walked out toward the car. And as he went, he felt a strange lightness in his chest. The feeling of a man who had just witnessed something he had stopped hoping to see a very long time ago. Wally returned the following afternoon, and he wasn't alone. The man with him was a small, wiry old fellow named Pruitt, who had been the accountant for Belandi Freight since Orson's father was alive. He had been retired for 4 years, and still wore his shirts buttoned all the way to the collar. The 2 men carried in 3 cardboard boxes. Pruitt set his box down, dusted off his hands, then looked at Orson and said, "I thought I would never have to see you again." He said nothing more about it. He simply opened the first box and began arranging papers on the table. 22 months, he said. "I took these from the copies in storage, not from the system, because anyone can get into the system. These require a key." Simon pulled out a chair and sat at one end of the table. Clem stood at the other end and didn't sit down. Orson sat between them. Pruitt began. He offered no explanations. He simply placed each file in front of Orson in chronological order, and every time he set one down, he tapped a finger against a single line. 3 names, he said. "They're all here." He read them aloud, slowly, as though calling the names of 3 people from an attendance list. "Halloway Marine, Trestle Point Carriers, 9th Line Haulage." Orson read the 3rd name twice. "None of the 3 has a real address," Pruitt said. "I sent someone to every location. One was a mailbox inside a print shop. One was a 3rd-floor apartment where an old woman lives. and she said she had never heard that name before. The third one did have a warehouse, but the warehouse belonged to someone else, and they had been leasing it for 6 years. None of them has a valid freight registration. None of them has driver logs. None of them has a single shipment I could trace, but all 3 submitted invoices, regularly, every month. He placed the next file on the table. Orson opened it. He asked no questions. He merely turned the pages one at a time, his eyes moving down the column on the right. Pruitt continued. At first the amounts were small enough that they didn't trigger anything. I did this work for 40 years, and I'll tell you the truth, if I were still sitting in that office, I wouldn't have noticed them either, because they stayed below the threshold. When something stays below the threshold, the system doesn't sound an alarm, and people don't bother to read. By the 9th month, the amounts started growing. By the 14th, they stopped trying to be careful. He pushed the final file across the table. The total over 22 months is $2,400,000, he said. Orson still said nothing. He turned to the next page. Simon was the one who asked, "Who authorized the payments?" Pruitt opened another file, folded its cover back, and pointed. "Every one of them was approved under Mr. Ferrante's spending authority," he said. "Not a single payment is missing. The signatures are valid, the authority is valid, and the approval level is correct. The accounting department followed proper procedure. No one did anything wrong. They simply followed a signature they had no reason to question." "Is there anything else?" Simon asked. Pruitt fell silent for a moment. Then he took out the last file, much thinner than the others, and placed it in front of Orson instead of Simon. "There are 11 large payments," he said. "Payments above the threshold required approval from one additional level. All 11 bear your wife's approval." No one in the factory spoke. Clem looked at Orson. He didn't raise his head. He opened the thin file and read it from beginning to end, every page without skipping a single one. And he spent longer reading it than he had spent on all the other files combined. Nearly 7 minutes passed on the clock hanging on the wall. Then he closed the file, laid his hand on top of it, and sat motionless. He didn't say a word. No one in the room dared disturb that silence. At last, Simon spoke, and his voice was very quiet. "You understand what this means, don't you?" Orson gave a single nod. "It means I was wrong," he said. "I thought they needed me dead so they could take a sum of money." He tapped one finger lightly against the file beneath his hand. "They didn't. They needed me to disappear before I sat down and read this." He looked up at Pruitt. "You kept the books for my family for 30 years, he said. "If you had retired 2 years later, they would have had to do this 2 years sooner." The old man didn't answer. He only bent down and straightened the papers into a neat stack. And Orson saw that both of his hands were trembling. On Tuesday morning, the second floor of the old restaurant on Thames Street opened earlier than usual. 12 people sat around the long table, and at its head, in the place where only 2 men had sat in the past 25 years, Cormac Ferrante rose to his feet. He was in no hurry. He fastened a button on his jacket, swept his gaze around the room, called 3 people at the far end of the table by name, and asked after their wives and children before he began. That was what he did best. By the time he came to the matter at hand, the entire room was already leaning toward him. "We don't have time for endless discussion," he said. "People out there are waiting to see whether this house can still stand. Every day we hesitate costs us another contract. What we need now is a decisive period of transition, not a committee, not a vote that drags on for 3 months. One person who takes responsibility, who can sign, who can make decisions, and who will answer for them if they're wrong." He let those words rest on the table for exactly as long as they needed to. Then he continued, his voice dropping by precisely 1 degree. "I know some people in this room feel it's too soon. I feel it's too soon too. He was my brother. I had been eating at his family table since I was 9 years old." He paused and raised a hand to adjust his tie, and no one in the room saw his hand tremble, because it didn't. But if he were sitting here now, he would be the first man to pound this table and tell us to stop weeping and get back to work. Someone quietly cleared his throat. Several heads nodded. Then Cormac turned to his left. Sloane Belandi had been sitting there from the beginning, silent, with a leather-bound notebook already open in front of her. She stood, thanked everyone for coming, and apologized in advance because she might have to stop halfway through. No one in the room thought the sentence had been rehearsed. She presented the financial picture for 10 minutes, clearly and precisely, without straying by a single word. And exactly twice she paused for a breath before continuing, both times in exactly the right place, neither too soon nor too late. At the end of her presentation, she said she hoped everyone understood that she wasn't standing there as anyone's wife, but as the person responsible for those numbers. A man sitting near the middle of the table, said the family was fortunate to have her. She lowered her head and sat down. Of the 12 people around that table that day, not one suspected anything. That same afternoon, Sloane went to the Harmon Cross funeral home. She went alone, signed for her husband's personal effects, checked each item against the list, the watch, the wallet, the wedding ring, then signed where a pencil mark had already been placed. Mr. Harmon stood on the other side of the counter. As he replaced the cap on his pen, she asked, "What about the cremation? Has that been taken care of yet?" Mr. Harmon said it hadn't. He told her the city was running behind. The permit from the health department still hadn't arrived, and when a case was closed quickly, the licensing office tended to examine it more carefully. Sloane said nothing. She looked down at the envelope of personal belongings in her hand, then raised her eyes. "How much longer?" "I can't promise," Mr. Harmon said. "A few days, perhaps more." "Then while we're waiting," she said, "may I see my husband one more time?" Mr. Harmon set the pen down on the counter. "Ma'am, the casket has already been sealed. We followed the family's wishes." He lowered his eyes, opened the ledger in front of him, turned it around, and pointed to a line. "You signed this on the 9th. Sloane looked down at her own signature. She said nothing for 3 seconds. In an empty room, those 3 seconds felt very long. Then she folded the envelope, tucked it beneath her arm, and said, "I understand. Thank you. Please let me know when the permit arrives." She walked to the door. Mr. Harmon watched until her car had left the parking lot. He remained there a while longer, both hands resting on the counter, remembering how many women had stood in that exact place during his 40 years in the business and asked him that same question. He remembered their voices. He remembered the way they had been forced to stop in the middle of a sentence just to breathe. Then he went into the back room, closed the door, and sat in his chair for a long time before reaching for the telephone. Mr. Harmon called the fish factory that evening. He told Orson what had happened at the funeral home in less than 2 minutes, plainly and without adding a single unnecessary word, and he ended with one sentence. She didn't ask like a woman in grief. She asked like someone waiting for a contractor who was behind schedule. Orson thanked him and hung up. He stood beside the telephone for a moment. Then he folded that feeling into something very small, put it away somewhere inside his chest, and returned to the table. He would need it later. Clem had been working there since the afternoon. She worked like someone accustomed to keeping records, with one notebook, one pen, and a long procession of underlined words. She took the 3 names Pruitt had read aloud the day before and searched for them through the shipping documents, not in the payment ledgers, but in the birth allocation records. She said she wanted to know which shipments 3 companies with no trucks had invoiced. Simon told her to try. At 9 o'clock that evening, she stopped writing. She sat motionless for a long time, the tip of her pen still pressed against the page, until the ink spread into a small round blot. Then she tore out the sheet, stood, walked around the table, and placed it in front of Orson. "9th line haulage," she said. "Does this name look familiar to you?" Orson looked down. There were 7 lines on the page, 1 date on each line, all of them falling within 3 weeks of December the previous year. 7 times in 3 weeks, Clem said. During the other 22 months, this name appears only here and there, once or twice a month. Those 3 weeks are the only period when it appears this often, and all 7 times were at the same pier. She placed her finger on the 5th line from the top. "This date," she said. Orson read it. He didn't need her to say anything more. He knew that date. He had signed a check connected to that date, though when he signed it, all he had seen was a single summary line and a number. Clem straightened. Her voice was perfectly ordinary, and it was that very ordinariness that gave the question its weight. "I'm going to ask you one question," she said. "You can answer with nothing more than yes or no." He looked up. "The forensic records for Pier 9 were sealed," she said. "They weren't destroyed. They were sealed. Someone had to sign the order to seal them. Did you sign that order?" Orson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He tried to remember. He truly tried to remember, not to find an answer he could give her. He remembered where he had been that month. He remembered that there had been 2 trips that week. He remembered the morning someone placed a stack of papers in front of him in the 4th floor conference room, with Cormac standing beside him and saying the familiar words, "Let me take care of this." He remembered signing. He didn't remember what he had signed. "I don't remember," he said. Clem gave one slow nod. "Do you hear what that sounds like?" she asked. He didn't answer. "From where you sit," she said. "Not remembering and saying yes are the same thing. My father lay in a morgue for 11 days. No one in my family was allowed to read a single line about what happened that night, and the reason was a signature whose owner is sitting here now telling me he doesn't remember." She picked up her notebook, closed it, and tucked it beneath her arm. "I need to go outside for a while," she said. She didn't slam the door. She simply walked out, and it closed behind her with a very quiet sound. Orson remained alone in the factory for nearly an hour without turning on another light. Then he pulled the computer toward him and opened the internal archive, the section containing old legal records, something he hadn't touched in 2 years because someone else had always taken care of it. He searched by the peer code. He searched by month. He opened the file close to 1 o'clock in the morning. There wasn't much inside. A 2-page incident report, a petition to waive an independent forensic examination, a sealing order, and at the bottom of the petition requesting the waiver, on the final line, there was a signature. Orson stared at it. Then he opened the other file, the succession addendum Simon had shown him, and placed the 2 documents side by side on the screen. The same slant, the same hook in the first letter, the same way the final letter swept downward and then flicked upward in a single stroke. A stroke Orson himself made only when signing in haste. He studied the 2 signatures for a very long time. Then he reached for the telephone and dialed Simon's number. The attorney answered on the second ring, his voice heavy with sleep. Orson said only one sentence. The same hand. The car pulled up outside the fish factory at 10 o'clock the next morning. Wally got out first and opened the rear door. He wouldn't look Orson in the eye as he stepped across the threshold. "I couldn't keep it from her," he said quietly. "She asked me directly. I've served this family for 28 years. I couldn't lie to her." Rosalind Belandi entered behind him. She was 65 years old, with a straight back, and she wore gloves in the middle of the day. She stopped in the center of the factory and looked her son over from head to toe. She looked at the borrowed sweater, the shoes that weren't his, and the table behind him buried beneath papers. She looked at him for a very long time. She didn't step forward. She didn't embrace him. "You're alive," she said. "Yes, 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, you let me sit in that church. You let me choose the flowers." Orson didn't defend himself. "I'm sorry, Mother," he said. Rosalind nodded once, the nod of a woman acknowledging a debt rather than accepting an apology. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down, removing her gloves 1 finger at a time. "I've heard everything," she said. "Wally told me on the way here." She placed the gloves on the table. "What do you intend to do?" "I'm already doing it," Orson said. He pushed the stack of documents toward her. 22 months of records, 2 forged signatures, 1 altered laboratory report. "I'm putting it all together into something I can take to the prosecutor." Rosalind didn't look down at the papers. She looked directly into her son's face. "This family has its own way of handling things," she said. "It has for 3 generations. No one in the factory dared breathe too deeply." 3 generations, Orson said. "And my father still didn't live past 58. Rosalind sat perfectly still. Something passed across her face and vanished at once, so quickly that only someone who had lived beside her for 34 years could have caught it. She didn't answer him. She merely turned her head and looked at Clem, who had been leaning against the filing cabinet all this time, holding the notebook where she recorded Orson's pulse. "You're the nurse," Rosalind said. "Yes. You're the one who opened that lid." "No," Clem said. He sat up on his own. "I was only the person who walked into the room." Rosalind nodded, as though the answer had made her even more certain of what she was about to say. She opened the small purse in her lap, took out a check that had already been written, laid it on the table, and pushed it across with the tips of 2 fingers. "I'm grateful to you," she said. "Truly, but I've lived nearly 40 years longer than you, and I'm going to tell you something. During weeks like this one, people tend to cling to whoever happens to be standing nearest to them. Then 6 months later, they look back and can't understand why. You're a charming accident in a very bad week, Miss Barlow. Don't let it become something longer than it ought to be." Clem looked at the check. She looked at it for a long time, long enough for Orson to rise from his chair. He hadn't managed to say anything before she stepped toward the table. She didn't pick up the check. She merely placed 1 finger against its edge and turned it face down, neatly, as though turning over a playing card. "You can't buy me," she said. Her voice was no louder than when she read a pulse. "Not because I'm noble. I'm not noble, ma'am. I'm drowning in debt, and I'm under suspension. And if you had handed me this piece of paper 2 years ago, I would have taken it." She paused. "The problem is that 2 years ago, I did take a piece of paper just like it, and I haven't slept since." Rosalind said nothing. "You don't have to believe I'm here because I'm kind," Clem continued. "You can think I'm here for the money, out of curiosity, or because it makes me feel important. You can think whatever you like, but don't tell me I'm something that happened by chance, something amusing for 1 week and then forgotten." She looked directly at Rosalind. "I'm not an accident. I have a name. My father had a name too, and you will find it in that pile of papers on the table. Read it, and then say to me again what you just said." The only sound left in the factory was the wind slipping through the gap beneath the door. Rosalind Belandi sat motionless, both hands resting on her gloves, and for the first time that morning, she had no answer ready. The request Simon had submitted through his notary's office had been sitting on someone's desk at Harbor Mercy for 3 days. During those 3 days, a man named Pell searched the patient's name in the system, saw the date, and made a telephone call. After that call, Cormac Ferrante sat motionless in his 4th-floor office at Belandi Freight for nearly 10 minutes. He didn't pound the desk. He didn't summon anyone. He simply opened a drawer, took out the paper address book he still used instead of a telephone, for matters he didn't want leaving a trace, and turned to the letter H. By that afternoon, a complaint had been sent to the Maryland State Board of Nursing. It was anonymous, but anonymous in precisely the right way, meaning it cited the exact shift codes, the exact medication cabinet code, and 3 discrepancies in the intensive care unit's controlled substances inventory over a period of 4 months. Those 3 discrepancies were real. Every intensive care unit in America had discrepancies like them, caused by a counting error, a delayed entry, or a shift overwhelmed by too many patients. The skill of the person who wrote the complaint didn't lie in inventing anything. It lay in inventing nothing at all. He had simply placed 3 harmless truths beside one another and left a single name standing in the middle. The summons arrived at Clem's home on Friday. She was sitting in Wally's car in the parking lot behind the hospital when Hattie sent her a message. Hattie was being transferred to the outpatient department at the beginning of the following week. The decision had been signed the previous afternoon, and the reason given was staff reorganization. Clem read the message, then opened the envelope in her hands. There were 2 pages inside. The first stated that a formal complaint had been filed alleging that Clementine Barlow, followed by her nursing license number, appeared to have misappropriated controlled substances during her employment in the intensive care unit at Harbor Mercy Hospital. The second was a notice to appear at a hearing 4 days from now. Clem read both pages to the end. Then she read them a second time, more slowly. Her hands didn't tremble. Wally sat in the driver's seat, watching her through the rearview mirror, and asked nothing. He simply waited. Then Clem folded the 2 pages along their original creases, placed them back in the envelope, and spoke in her ordinary voice. "Could you take me back to the factory?" On the way there, she said only one more thing. "If I lose this, I won't be allowed to work as a nurse in any state again. Not for a year, forever." At the fish factory, Simon read the 2 pages first. He read them quickly, then set them down and straightened in his chair. "This was written by someone who understands the law," he said. "It isn't an anonymous letter from someone nursing a grudge. Whoever wrote it knew exactly what would force the board to convene a hearing. They could have ignored 3 discrepancies. But 3 discrepancies combined with an employee already suspended for allegedly altering medical records means they are required to investigate." He looked up at Clem. "They don't need to beat you. They only need to destroy your credibility. Once a nurse loses her license over controlled substances, no matter what evidence you bring into a courtroom afterward, that will be the first thing opposing counsel asks about." At some point, Orson had risen from his chair. He walked to the window at the far end of the factory, the one overlooking the water, and stood there. He said nothing. Simon continued talking about procedure, how soon they had to respond, and whether Clem should hire separate counsel for the hearing. Clem answered every question. Orson remained at the window. He didn't turn around once. He didn't ask who was behind the complaint, because he didn't need to ask. He said nothing about what he intended to do, and because of that, after a while, Simon stopped talking too. The only sound left in the factory was the water striking the pilings beneath the pier outside. Orson stood there for nearly 40 minutes. Wally sat in the chair beside the door, with both hands resting on his knees, watching the back of the man at the window. He had driven for this family for 28 years. He had waited outside in the car while people argued behind closed doors. He had heard Orson's father shout so loudly that a glass shattered. He had watched large men speak in very loud voices inside very small rooms. And he knew something very few people in that city had lived long enough to learn. When Orson Belandi fell silent, that was when people should be afraid. Simon returned at 11 o'clock that night, after Clem had gone home and only 3 people remained in the factory. He didn't open his briefcase right away. He sat down, removed his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, and did all of it more slowly than usual, the way a man delays the moment when he must begin speaking. Then he took out a thin file and placed it in the center of the table. "This isn't about them," he said. "This is about you." Orson pulled the file toward him. The first page was a standard form from the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland. "I had a preliminary conversation," Simon said. "I didn't use any names. I asked them what they would require if someone wanted to bring them a case like this. He tapped the file lightly. This is what they require. Orson turned the page. Everything, Simon said. Not the portion you choose. If you give them the records from the past 22 months, you also give them the records from all the years before that. If you give them the forged signatures of other people, you also give them your real signatures. If you identify Pier 9, you identify every other pier as well. He paused. There is no door through which you can enter that room as a victim and walk back out intact. Once you open that ledger, it opens at both ends. Orson turned another page. Second, Simon said, you submit to an investigation. You personally, from the beginning. They will ask you questions no one has dared ask you in 20 years, and you will have to answer them. One lie will destroy the entire agreement. Third, you let go. I don't mean reducing operations or transferring names. I mean letting go. Anything legal is brought into the light and subjected to an independent audit. Anything illegal is shut down, and you sit there and watch someone else operate the name that belongs to you. Fourth, your finances will be monitored for years. Every account, every transfer. He pushed the file a little closer. And finally, this isn't written on the page, but you need to hear it. You could still be sentenced. Full cooperation is usually taken into consideration, but no one is guaranteeing you anything. They could take everything you give them and prosecute you anyway. The factory was very quiet. Simon looked at Orson over the rims of his glasses. You understand that you're writing your own indictment, don't you? I understand, Orson said. Do you truly understand? Or are you angry? I truly understand. Simon sat silently for a while. Then he took a pen from the inside pocket of his coat and placed it beside the file. He didn't put it into Orson's hand. He merely laid it there and said, I've practiced law for this family for 20 years, and this is the first time I've ever placed a pen on a table without knowing whether I should hope you pick it up or hope you leave it there. From the chair near the door, Wally spoke. He had been sitting there since the afternoon, silent the entire time. And now he asked in the voice of a man who had earned the right to ask, Sir, what do you gain by doing this? No one is asking you to go that far. Give them only what belongs to those two people, and it will be over. You will still have everything. Orson didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the black water beyond it. Uncle Wally, he said, how many years did you drive for my father? 19 years. Then he died at 58, and the whole city came to bury him, Orson said. Do you remember how many people came that day? A great many. Yes, Orson said. A great many. And in that entire crowd, I don't believe there were even 5 people whose lives became worse because he was gone. He kept looking out the window. I lay inside that wooden box for 3 hours, he said, and during those 3 hours, I couldn't think of a single reason anyone should have mourned me. No one spoke. I'm not doing this so I can be forgiven, Orson said. I'm doing it because if they carry me away for real the next time, I want there to be at least one reason left behind. He turned back to the table, pulled out the chair, sat down, picked up the pen Simon had placed there, and opened the file to the final page. The attorney studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, Sign here. Wally remained in the chair near the door, his hands resting on his knees. He lowered his head, and no one in the room saw his face then. The next morning, Orson told her he had a way. He spoke briefly and made no promises. He said only that there were 2 people on the State Board of Nursing whom he knew how to reach, and that an anonymous complaint could disappear just as anonymously as it had arrived. Clem listened to everything. Then she asked, What do you intend to do with those 2 people? Talk to them. Nothing more than talk. Orson, she said. It was the first time she had called him by his name. If you clear the way for me, I may be able to keep my license. But from that day forward, every time I pick up a patient's chart, I will know what I'm holding it with. And for the rest of my life, I will belong to you. Not because you want me to, because I will know it myself. She picked up the envelope. Let me go in there on my own. If I lose, then I lose as myself. Orson said nothing more. He simply nodded. The hearing began at 9 o'clock Tuesday morning in a conference room inside the State Administration Building, with 5 people seated at an elevated table and 1 small table below them. Clem arrived alone. She wore the same suit she had worn to job interviews 7 years earlier. She placed exactly 3 things in front of her: a notebook, a pen, and the envelope. The representative presenting the complaint spoke first. It took 12 minutes, and the presentation was concise. 3 discrepancies in the controlled substances inventory. An employee already under suspension for allegedly altering medical records. Nothing more needed to be said. Then it was Clem's turn. She didn't argue each point individually. She said nothing about her suspension, offered no account of her circumstances, and didn't mention her debts or her brother. She said only that she didn't deny the 3 discrepancies, that her intensive care unit had recorded 48 discrepancies during those same 4 months, that she had been on duty during 22 of them, and that her name had been singled out in only 3. Then she said she was asking the board for one thing, and one thing only. The chairwoman asked what it was. The access log for Harbor Mercy Hospital's medical record system on the night of the 14th, from midnight until 6 o'clock in the morning, Clem said. The chairwoman asked what that had to do with controlled substances. Nothing, Clem said. But this entire complaint stands on the fact that I'm already accused of altering a medical record. If I didn't alter that record, then the foundation of this complaint disappears. And Harbor Mercy uses an old system. It permanently records who signed in, which record they opened, the exact hour and minute, and which line they changed. There is no delete button. No one has ever gone in and cleared it. She placed one hand on her notebook. I'm not asking the board to believe me. I'm asking the board to open that log. Silence settled over the elevated table. Then the chairwoman said the request was valid and adjourned the hearing until the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, the log was printed and placed on the table. It was 9 pages long. On the 4th page was a single entry. The patient record bearing that identification code had been opened at 3:38 in the morning and altered at 3:41, one line only, using the employee access card of a resident physician named Pell. Clem said nothing when the entry was read aloud. She simply opened the envelope and removed the second document, the one Simon had lawfully obtained through his office from the case file opened by the prosecutor, and asked permission to submit it. The document showed a transfer into Dr. Pell's personal bank account 3 weeks after the night of the 14th, sent by a freight company called Ninth Line Haulage. The chairwoman read the document. She handed it to the person seated on her right. That person read it and passed it on. All 5 members read it, and no one spoke, and the air in the room changed in the way only people who had sat in rooms like that could recognize. The hearing ended at 4:10. The complaint was dismissed. Harbor Mercy's suspension decision was formally recommended for review. Clem stepped into the hallway and walked about 20 paces before she had to stop. She placed one hand against the wall and stood there for a very long time. Clem arrived at the fish factory at 7 o'clock that evening. She didn't bring the notebook where she recorded Orson's pulse. She carried a cloth bag and a faded leather-bound notebook, the pocket-sized kind dock workers used to record cargo counts and the time their shifts ended. She placed it on the table in front of Orson. "It belonged to my father," she said. "They returned it with the rest of his things. There's nothing in it, just numbers and times." His handwriting was terrible. Orson didn't touch the notebook. She sat in the chair across from him, placed both hands on the table, and spoke. "I won today." "I know," he said. "Uncle Wally told me. I won because of an access log no one had bothered to erase for more than 10 years, she said. "That means the thing that could have proven the truth for me had been sitting there for the past 2 years. It was only 3 floors away from where I worked. No one opened it because no one needed to." She looked down at her hands. "I've been thinking about that all afternoon," she said. "There was a piece of paper like that from the night at Pier 9. It had been lying somewhere for 2 years too, and no one opened it either." Orson sat quietly. "I believe you didn't sign it," she said. "I truly do. I've seen both signatures, and I believe you. But I need to tell you something, and when I've said it, I'm leaving." She raised her eyes. "You didn't sign it, but you built the kind of place where one sheet of paper could bury a man who had worked for 30 years, and for 2 years not one person would ask why. Not because they were cruel, because they knew whose name stood at the top of that page. My father lay in a morgue for 11 days, and the thing that kept anyone from knocking on a door and asking questions wasn't a gun. It was your name. You built that. You built it very carefully." Orson didn't argue. He could have. He could have said he hadn't known, that other people had used his own name against him, that he too had been buried inside a box. He said none of it. He sat in silence, and after a while he said, "You're right." Then he continued, "There is something I haven't told anyone. 3 days ago, I signed an agreement with the United States Attorney's Office." Clem didn't move. "I'm turning over everything," he said. "Not just the parts that belong to Cormac and Sloan. Everything, including the things with my name on them. I'm submitting to an investigation, surrendering control, and allowing my finances to be monitored for years. And I may still have to stand trial like anyone else." He pushed the file toward her. "Simon said I was writing my own indictment." He was right. Clem looked at the file but didn't pick it up. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. "Because you're the first person I've told," he said. "My mother doesn't know. No one in the family knows." The factory remained silent for a long time. Then Clem stood. "I'm still leaving," she said. Orson looked up. He didn't ask why. That was another thing she took note of about him. "If I stay tonight," she said, "then 30 years from now, I will still remember that I stayed on the very night you told me you had turned yourself in, and I will never know for certain whether I stayed because of you or because I felt moved by what you had just done." She lifted the bag onto her shoulder. "I've just lost 2 years of my life inside something I didn't choose. I don't want to walk directly out of that and into something else I didn't choose either." She walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped and looked back. "If there comes a day when I return," she said, "it has to be because I choose you, not because you saved me, and not because you're trying to make amends." She looked at him for one more second. "Finish what you have to do." Then she walked out. The door closed softly, just as it had the last time. Orson remained alone. After a while, he reached for the leather-bound notebook she had left on the table and opened it. Inside was exactly what she had described. Nothing but numbers and times, written in a hurried, slanting hand. He turned to the end. On the final page, beneath an unfinished column of figures, there was a single line written in a different hand, slower and far more careful. "Remember to buy a battery for Tobin's watch." Simon and Wally worked for 2 full days after Clem left. Mr. Pruitt came back once more, bringing the original birth allocation ledger that the archive had preserved on paper, the kind no one had ever bothered to digitize because it recorded nothing more than the order in which cargo was placed in the yard. At noon on the second day, Simon called Orson back to the table. "We've put it all together," he said. "Sit down first." Orson sat. Simon placed 3 things in front of him, one after another. The first was the birth allocation ledger for those 3 weeks in December. 7 shipments assigned to Ninth Line haulage, all at the same pier, all during the same hours of the night. The second was the yard's handwritten load count report, bearing the shift supervisor's signature. The figure on that report was lower than the actual figure recorded on the weigh station slips at the yard gate. The difference was too large to have been a mistake. "This discrepancy wasn't meant to steal money," Simon said. "It was meant to hide an unrecorded shipment among the others. To conceal it, they had to stack more cargo on top. To stack that much, they had to exceed the permitted limit, and the person who approved that night shift, in the box reserved for a superior, was Mr. Ferrante." Orson looked at that box. Then Simon brought out the third item, the petition to waive an independent forensic examination that Orson himself had found the other night. "We sent both signatures to a document examiner," he said. "The preliminary written opinion arrived this morning. They were written by the same person, and that person wasn't you. You sign with your right hand. This person also signs with the right hand, but presses harder on the final stroke, and that exact pressure pattern appears on both documents." Orson placed his hand over the 2 pages. He said nothing. "There is one more thing," Simon said, and his voice changed. "Mr. Pruitt found it yesterday." He pushed a thin file across the table. "The settlement paid to the Barlow family didn't come through the company's liability insurance fund. Your wife handled it separately through a special disbursement channel." He turned a page. "And the money funding that channel came from 2 reimbursements issued by Trestle Point carriers during the same month." Orson read the line. Then he read it again. "The money used to pay the Barlow family for their silence," Simon said, "was money those 2 had taken from this very company." No one in the fish factory spoke. Wally rose, walked to the window, and stood there with his back to them. Orson remained very still. He remembered an afternoon in December of that year, when Sloane had handed him a 1-page summary and told him the matter at Pier 9 had been resolved, that the family had agreed to the settlement, and that there was nothing more to worry about. He remembered thanking her. He remembered saying, "I'm lucky to have you." Simon allowed the silence to remain for a while. Then he took out the final document. "And there's this," he said. 14 months ago. Do you remember the fire at Warehouse 3? "I remember," Orson said. "An electrical short. I was inside. I got out through the east door. The official report says it was an electrical short," Simon said. "But there is something the report doesn't contain." He placed the document on the table. It was an insurance claim, fully prepared, every field completed, except the filing date. It had been drafted before the investigation into the fire had reached a conclusion. It had never been submitted. It had remained in the internal archive for the past 14 months. Orson looked down. In the right margin, beside the blank filing date, 2 words had been written by hand in small, neat letters. The same handwriting he had seen on thousands of documents over the past 12 years. "On hold." Simon removed his glasses and set them on the table. "Do you understand what I've just given you?" he asked. "If all we had were what happened the other night, the defense would call it an isolated incident, a moment of madness, an accident that had been misunderstood. But now we have what happened 14 months ago. We have a completed claim prepared in advance and put away when you didn't die. And we have the words on hold written by hand. He paused. This isn't a case built on one piece of evidence. It's a case built on a pattern. Orson sat motionless for a very long time. Then he gathered the 3 files into a single stack, carefully straightened their edges, and spoke in a voice so ordinary that Wally had to turn around and look at him. Send everything to the prosecutor today. Hold nothing back. He placed his hand on the stack of papers, including my part. Rosalind Belandi came to the fish factory the next morning, and this time she didn't wait for anyone to open the door. She walked straight inside, set her purse on a chair, and didn't remove her gloves. What did you sign with them? She asked. Simon rose to speak. She lifted one hand. I asked my son, Orson told her. He kept it brief and softened nothing. He said he had turned over everything, including anything that bore his own name. He said he had agreed to submit to an investigation. He said he was letting go. Rosalind listened to it all, and she didn't sit down once while he spoke. Do you know your father spent 19 years building that name? She asked. I know, and you know what he used to build it. I know, and now you've carried it in and laid it on a table for strangers to examine, she said. Page by page, you opened the cabinets of your own house with your own hands and let strangers count what was inside. Orson didn't answer. Rosalind stepped a little closer. I don't need you to kill anyone, she said. I have never told you to do that, and I never will. But this family has its own way of handling things, and that way doesn't require a court or the signature of some prosecutor. In 3 generations, I have never seen anyone take the kind of roundabout path you're taking now. Mother, Orson said, listen to what I'm saying. I tried the old way for 12 years. He pointed to the stack of papers on the table. The old way is what allowed this to happen, because under the old way, no one is permitted to ask questions. No one is permitted to open a document and say, something here isn't right. Someone says, let me take care of it. Everyone nods. And that is the entire system my father left me. That is how 2 people living inside my own house took $2,400,000 in 22 months without anyone making a sound. He lowered his voice. It wasn't because they were clever. It was because I had already built them a house where no one was allowed to ask questions. Rosalind stood motionless. There is something else, Orson said. If I handle this the old way, it will be over in 3 seconds. 3 seconds, Mother. Then 6 months from now, in every bar on Thames Street, people will be telling the story of a man the Belandi family punished because he dared sit in their chair. He will become a martyr. People will forget everything he did and remember only the way he died. He placed his hand on the stack of files. I won't give him that. I will take everything from him, one thing at a time. His chair, his name, his signature, the people who still rise when he enters a room. I will take it all, slowly, and I will leave him sitting there to watch. The factory was very quiet. Rosalind looked at her son for a long time. Then, she pulled out a chair and sat down, and it was the first time she had ever taken a seat in that building. Are you finished? She asked. Yes, Mother. She nodded. I don't agree, she said. I'm telling you plainly that I don't agree. I think you're handing our family over to strangers, and they won't give it back. But then she placed both hands in her lap and continued. 3 weeks ago, I sat in that church and chose flowers for you. I will not stand here and tell you what you must do anymore. She said nothing else. She simply remained there until noon, silent, while Simon called the state prosecutor's office, and 3 members of the federal task force arrived to take custody of the evidence. That afternoon, 3 things happened at the same time. All the documents, the records from 22 months, the 2 handwriting analysis reports, and the insurance file prepared 14 months earlier were formally surrendered and receipts were issued. Acting on Orson's behalf, Simon legally purchased every personal loan Cormac Ferrante still held in his own name at 3 separate institutions, through the banks and with full notarization, and before the ink had time to dry, every one of Cormac's credit lines was frozen, and a petition to unseal the forensic records from Pier 9 was filed in state court, with Orson Belandi named as the petitioner. When Simon put away his pen, he looked at Orson and said, You understand that from this point forward, you can't take any of it back. Orson looked through the window toward the water. I don't intend to, he said. At 7 o'clock Thursday evening, 12 people sat around the long table on the 2nd floor of the old restaurant on Thames Street, and this time there was a single page in front of each of them. Cormac Ferrante stood at the head of the table, finishing his final sentence. Then, with your permission, he said, as of tonight, we are no longer in a period of waiting. Before he could continue, the door at the far end of the room opened. Orson Belandi walked in. He wore a dark suit with no tie. He moved slowly, no faster than necessary, And when he reached the center of the room, he stopped. The room broke apart in waves. The people nearest the door turned first. Then the movement traveled toward the far end of the table. Chairs shifted. Someone let out a short sound and swallowed it at once. A man seated near the middle sprang to his feet, then immediately sat down again, as though his legs had acted on their own. At the head of the table, Cormac didn't move. The hand holding his paper remained at exactly the same height. The expression everyone knew so well, the expression of a man who knew the entire room was watching him, had vanished. And what remained on his face had no name. Sloane sat to his left. She turned like everyone else, and the blood drained from her face in a single beat. Her hand rested on the open leather notebook before her, and it never moved again. Orson let the silence remain for nearly 10 seconds. Then he walked to the head of the table, stood in the place where Cormac had just been standing, and spoke in an even voice. "I have 6 things to say. Anyone who wants to leave may leave now." No one left. "First," he said, "the blood test taken during the first 30 minutes after I was brought to Harbor Mercy contained one line that no longer appears in the version now stored in the system. The paper copy printed that night still exists. The 2 versions differ by exactly 1 line. Second, my death certificate was signed by a doctor I had never met. My family refused an autopsy in writing in less than 2 hours. My entire case was closed within 24 hours. No one in the room dared breathe deeply. Third, he said, 3 months before that night, my family trust was restructured, and a succession addendum was attached to it, specifically naming one person who would assume control immediately if I died." He looked at Cormac. "That addendum bears my signature. A document examiner has concluded in writing that I wasn't the person who signed it. Fourth, over 22 months, $2,400,000 left this company through 3 contractors with no trucks, no registration, and not a single traceable shipment. Every payment was made under Mr. Ferrante's spending authority. 11 large payments also carried Mrs. Belandi's approval." Sloane's head snapped up. "Fifth," Orson said, without quickening his pace by even a fraction. 14 months ago, there was a warehouse fire that I survived. An insurance claim had been completed before the fire investigation reached its conclusion. It was never submitted. It was kept in the files. In the margin were 2 handwritten words, "On hold." He looked at his wife. She sat motionless. "Sixth," he said. "Pier 9, December, 2 years ago." "He wasn't the one behind it," Sloane said. The words burst from her mouth so quickly that even she seemed startled by them. "She handled the settlement," Cormac said without turning his head. "She prepared the insurance file. I never touched a single page of it. You told me it was routine. You stood in my kitchen and told me that." "You signed it," Cormac said. 3 sentences. Everyone seated around that long table heard all 3. Cormac rose. He looked around the room and began calling names. He called the man seated to his right. He called 2 people near the middle of the table. He called the man at the far end whose wife and children he had asked about at the previous meeting. He called each name clearly, one at a time, in the voice that had always made people rise. No one rose. All 12 people remained in their chairs and lowered their eyes to the table. Cormac stood there alone at the head of a very long table. Then the door at the far end of the room opened again. Clementine Barlow walked in. She went straight to the head of the table without looking at anyone and placed 2 documents in front of Cormac. The first was a receipt, acknowledging the transfer of evidence, stamped by the United States Attorney's Office and dated 6 days earlier. The second was the newly unsealed forensic report from Pier 9. And on the first line of the first page was the name of a man who had worked on the docks for 30 years. "You killed my father with a signature that wasn't yours," she said. "I'm sending you away with a signature that is mine." The doors opened. Federal agents entered from both sides. Sloane didn't rise. Cormac said the name of his attorney once. Then Orson stepped away from his place, walked toward the agent in charge, and extended both hands in front of him, exactly as required by the agreement he had signed 6 days earlier. Clem stood 3 paces away. She looked at those outstretched hands, and she saw the left hand missing 1 joint from the little finger, the hand she had held while taking his pulse in a dark room without asking a single question. This time, she understood. 3 days later, Clem worked her first afternoon shift since the suspension had been lifted. When she stepped into the employee parking lot close to 10 o'clock that night, a car was waiting in the outermost row with its lights off, and Rosalind Belandi stood beside the door. She wasn't wearing gloves. That was the first thing Clem noticed. "I've been waiting here for more than an hour," Rosalind said. "They told me your shift ended at 10. Clem stopped a few paces away. "How is your son?" "They released him on bail this afternoon," Rosalind said. "With conditions. He isn't allowed to leave the state." She said nothing more about it. She opened the car door, took a large envelope from the back seat, the stiff kind secured with string, and held it in both hands for a moment before offering it to Clem. "This belongs to you," she said. Clem didn't take it immediately. "What is it?" "The forensic report from Pier 9, Rosalind said. "The original. The complete report. Not the version the court just unsealed. This has been in the safe at my house for 2 years." Clem stood motionless. "Someone brought it to me 3 days after that night," Rosalind said. "I don't know who. I know only that it arrived, and I understood it had been brought to my house because it wasn't supposed to go anywhere else." She looked down at the envelope in her hands. "I didn't open it. Not once in 2 years. Clem didn't ask why. She didn't need to." Rosalind continued, speaking more slowly than usual. "I married my husband when I was 22, she said. "He taught me something during the first week, and I held on to it for 43 years. Some things are best left unknown. He told me that if I didn't know, then I wouldn't have to choose. And if I didn't have to choose, I would still be able to sleep." She paused, "And I did sleep. For 43 years. She extended the envelope. "Take it." Clem took it. It was heavier than she had expected. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Rosalind said. "I have no right to ask for that, and I don't intend to. I only want you to have this." Then she turned and opened the car door. Before getting in, she paused and added without looking back. "That day at the factory, I said something to you. You told me to read the papers and then say it again. I've read them." She closed the car door, and the car pulled away from the lot. That night, Clem went home and placed the envelope unopened on the dining table. Tobin was at his desk as usual. He looked at the envelope, then at his sister, then pushed himself away from the desk and rolled his wheelchair toward her. "What is it?" he asked. "Dad's," Clem said. "The complete report. Are you going to open it?" "Not yet," Tobin nodded. He sat in silence for a while, both hands resting in his lap, and then he said what he had wanted to say for 2 years. "Clem." "Yes?" "I know what you think every time you look at the wooden ramp outside the door." Clem didn't answer. "I know what you think every time you pick up one of those debt collection envelopes," Tobin said. "I know you think you traded Dad for me. You've thought that since the day you signed, and you've never said it aloud, and neither have I. I didn't say it because I thought that if I did, it would become true." Clem sat in the chair across from her brother. "I'm going to tell you this once," Tobin said. "I was 19 years old, lying on the 3rd floor with a tube in my throat. I couldn't sign. I couldn't speak. I couldn't do anything. You were the only person in our family still able to stand." He looked directly into his sister's eyes. "You signed so I could live. That is what you did. You didn't sell Dad. You saved the one who could still be saved." Clem lowered her face. "And I won't let you keep paying for that in installments for the rest of your life," Tobin said. "I don't agree to it. I'm the one who was saved, so I have the right to refuse." He reached for the envelope on the table and placed it in front of her. "Now we open it, and we read it." The brother and sister read the entire report from that night, from beginning to end, sitting beside each other at the small dining table. When they reached the final page, Clem wept. She wept for a very long time, and made almost no sound, while Tobin said nothing at all. He only placed one hand on his sister's back and left it there. 1 year later, Belandi Freight was still standing on the Baltimore waterfront, but it was no longer the company it had once been. Its books were independently audited twice a year. Every contract was open to public scrutiny, and everything that couldn't survive in the light had been shut down for good by spring. Cormac Ferrante received 25 years. Sloan Belandi received 12. Because of his full cooperation, Orson received a suspended sentence and 5 years of financial supervision. He no longer had any authority over the company. All that remained to him was his name on the sign. At the entrance to Pier 9, where 2 years earlier people had put up police tape and then quietly taken it down, there now stood a 2-story building with pale walls called the Amos Barlow Rehabilitation Center. Tobin trained there 3 times a week. He could stand with the support frame for about 4 minutes at a time, and he told his sister that 4 minutes was 4 minutes, and that was everything. Clem's nursing license had been restored in February, and she now directed the center's night program, created for people who had to work during the day and could only attend therapy after 9 o'clock in the evening. One night in late October, just as her shift ended, Clem opened the staff room door and found Orson standing in the hallway. He hadn't knocked. He stood there waiting for her to open the door, holding a document folder, in the same posture as a man who had once lain in darkness waiting for a door to open. He handed her the folder. Inside were documents transferring full ownership of the center to Clementine Barlow, with no conditions, no obligations, and not one line mentioning his name. "Now you don't owe me anything," he said, "so I'm asking again from the beginning." Clem read the document to the end. Then she folded it, placed it on the windowsill, and took his left hand the hand missing one joint from the little finger, the same hand she had held for the first time in a dark room when she hadn't yet known whose pulse she was feeling. There are truths people bury, believing time will keep watch over them forever. But truth doesn't decay like wood, and a signature that can buy silence can never buy peace of mind. In the end, what saves a human life isn't power or money. It is a stranger who chooses to do the right thing on a night when no one required them to do anything at all. If tonight's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love so that every day we can gather again and listen to another meaningful story together. How do you feel about Clementine and Orson's story? If you had been in her place, would you have taken the check? Or would you have chosen to preserve your name? Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we sincerely want to hear what is in your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, happiness, and peace with each passing day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.